The presentation of anarchism as social philosophy which aims at the emancipation, economic, social, political, and spiritual of the human race. The emancipation.
Anarchist Essays is brought to you by Loughborough University's Anarchism Research Group. For more information on the ARG, see the link in the show notes or follow us on Twitter at ARGLBORO.
I'm not someone who calls himself an anarchist, I am an anarchist. The continuing significance of anarchism in the later lives of ex-adherents of 1980s British anarcho-punk by Dr. Matt Grimes. This essay is based on my contribution to the recently published book Punk, Aging in Time, which was published in 2024 and that I co-edited with Dr. Laura Way. The essay originated from my PhD, Life We Make, Identity, Memory and British Anarcho-Punk, which was published in 2020. Based on a series of interviews, it was a longitudinal study of identitarian journeys through 1980s British anarcho-punk and its continuing significance in the later lives and identities of its ageing ex-adherents after they had relinquished their subcultural identitarian affiliation to anarcho-punk. The inclusion of the prefix anarcho, which is rooted in anarchism, with the existing subcultural term punk, suggests that there was a combinational development of a more politically and ideologically focused form of punk emerging as a distinctive subset of punk in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Therefore, the very term anarcho-punk would suggest that there was a link between punk and the political ideologies of anarchism. Whilst this essay does not seek to provide a historiography of anarchism, see Christian Meltzer, Woodcock and Marshall, it's worth noting that the first wave of punk adopted the sloganeering of anarchism mostly for shock value or as a rhetorical device, whereas British anarcho-punk took some of the political and ideological sloganeering of earlier first wave punk and politicised them in a more literal way. It was soon transformed within certain fragments of the punk movement into a space for a more organised form of dissent. Subsequently, anarchism was taken seriously by the newly emerging anarcho-punk scene as a means of interjecting a sense of fervent political self-awareness into the dwindling punk rock movement. However, anarcho-punk's interpretation and exposition of anarchism was, and still is, problematic and complicated. It didn't necessarily follow the tenets of traditional anarchist thinking and ideologies, and therein a different set of values outside of traditional anarchism developed within the 1980s British anarcho-punk subcultural scene. As British anarcho-punk emerged and developed, it appropriated the theoretical definition of anarchy in the sense that anarchy is the rejection of that state control and represents a demand by the individual to live a life of personal choice, not one of political manipulation. At the forefront of the emerging British anarcho-punk movement were the seminal anarcho-punk band Crass. Their ideological approach to anarchism was in many ways linked to the type of anarchism associated with the 1960s and 1970s hippie counterculture. The anarchism that Crass espoused was not the anarchy of the Pistols, but a lifestyle and worldview they developed through a combination of hippie idealism and resistance, punk energy and cheek, and some of the cultural strategies of the Situationist International. Crass's relationship with the counterculture further highlighted commonalities between hippies and British anarcho-punks in their resistance to the establishment. There was no one cohesive political agenda or ideology within British anarcho-punk, and that Crass's own interpretation of anarchism retained hippies' concern with the freedom of the individual from the intrusion of the state, but infused it with militant opposition to the war machine and a damning critique of the alienated social relations of capitalism. It was often in the DIY punk fanzines of the early 1980s where debates over what constituted anarchism, pacifism versus direct action, collective versus individual anarchism, created and maintained points of tension, with the Anarchist Youth Federation criticising Crass and the anarcho-punk movement of its pacifist approach and lack of commitment to direct action and confrontation with the system and all of its agents. For some of my research interviewees, Their introduction into British anarcho-punk and subsequently anarchism came about through their initial exposure during their adolescence to a number of anarcho-punk bands such as Crass, Poison Girls, Conflict and The Mob. Many of them gained their own initial understanding of anarchism and development of anarchist thoughts, principles and values from the political and ideological standpoints laid out in the lyrics and practices of those bands that they had been exposed to. As one of my interviewees, Russ, states, Crass set out the template for me politically and ideologically, what was relevant and real in the world. The first wave of punk informed our attitude. Anarcho-punk formed our philosophy and politics. This exposure to anarcho-punk bands also introduced them to a number of political ideologies that they may not have otherwise explored, as recounted by another one of my interviewees, Bob, who states, bands like Crass and the lyrics of the songs helped me at the time because I was so fucking angry with nowhere to place the anger. And they shaped me politically. So I channeled that anger and developed my own thoughts. They made me think a lot, you know. I went out and read political stuff I never would have read if it hadn't been for those songs. From what Bob suggests, not only did British anarcho-punk stir up an interest in politics, but it inspired him to seek out more knowledge and a greater understanding of anarchism and other political doctrines. For some of my respondents, there was already an existing knowledge of or deep-founded interest in anarchist principles, values and ideologies. Their perception and understanding of anarchism have mostly come about from engaging with anarchist texts and attending anarchist organisations and anarchist group meetings. One of my interviewees, Simon, had already been a member of an anarchist organisation when he was at university in the mid-1970s and was familiar with a number of anarchist philosophies. In one of my interviews with him, he said that many of the adherents of British anarcho-punk learnt their understanding of anarchism from Crass and other such like bands, which he saw as somewhat problematic. He further went on to say, Crass seemed to know very little about political anarchism and were using the symbols without much understanding of what anarchism was. They were advocating their form of anarchism without really coming at it from we're anarchists first. So there was quite a complicated set of politics going on there, and lots of anarcho-punks invested in Crass's form of anarchism and just reproduced it without really finding out about anarchy for themselves. Simon's narrative raises interesting issues about the notion of both anarchism and anarcho-punk identity. He suggests that Crass had set a template which others seem to follow or reproduce blindly without necessarily seeking out a deeper understanding of anarchism. This suggests that the signifiers and symbols of the British anarcho-punk movement and what constituted an anarcho-punk identity, both individual and collective, were predominantly determined by the beliefs and actions of Crass and other such like anarcho-punk bands. Simon and Guy had a previous understanding of more traditional anarchist ideologies and philosophies. Their attendance at meetings of a number of London-based anarchist organisations and groups brought them into contact with a number of punk anarchists who were also seeking a deeper understanding of anarchist politics and ideologies and ways they might practically apply anarchism. Through these various connections, both of them became involved in the Wapping Autonomy Centre, also known as the London Anarchy Centre, based in London's Dockland, right in the heart of London's newly developing financial centre. These types of community-based multi-purpose non-hierarchical social centres and temporary autonomous zones are often aligned to non-authoritarian anarchist principles based on mutual aid and providing a space for people to act out their non-authoritarian and non-hierarchical values, ideologies and principles. For Guy and Simon, to some extent, the Wapping Autonomy Centre provided a platform for them to engage in anarcho-punk praxis and enact their anarchist principles and ideologies. This is best summed up by Guy, who said, "What I wanted to do was to create a little bit of practical anarchy right there in the centre of capitalism and put some of what I'd read into practice. I wanted to show people that practical anarchy could work in a given situation, such as the Anarchy Centre. So we had a bar, we had a place to eat, places to stay. We organised stuff like talks, gigs, and it was all done on this non-hierarchical and non-profit basis. We weren't making money, and some of us put a lot of time into it because we wanted it to succeed, and it did succeed for a while." For Guy then, the opportunity to put on what he had read and understood into practice seems to suggest that for him, anarcho-punk praxis was an important part of not only being able to act out what he had embodied, but also his investment of time and energy to enable this. He was also willing to clearly demonstrate to others the potential for anarchism could work in a given situation, such as temporary autonomous zones, like the Wapping Autonomy Centre, and for him there was a will to make practical anarchism work. So for Guy, the theoretical approach to anarchism was important, however the actual application of his anarchist principles was even more important. Transition into adulthood can involve taking on a number of responsibilities, and that can often bring a change in values, beliefs and ideologies. As people mature, their political and ideological beliefs and values can change with their identities. As my interviewees have moved through their life course, they more than likely would have moved through a number of identities, taking with them some of those values and beliefs into each one as a form of residual identity. I was interested to find out if and how the political and ideological values and beliefs that were part of their adolescent anarcho-punk identity had in some ways remained with them. All of my interviewees stated that reflecting back on their time being an anarcho-punk during their adolescence had mostly a number of positive impacts on their lives then, and introduced them to a number of beliefs, ideologies and values that they still hold on to now. These include anarchism, animal rights and personal politics. However, whilst anarchism was connected to a common set of ideologies, my interviewees' interpretation and manifestation of those beliefs varied. I asked those who state that they were anarchists then whether they still considered themselves to be anarchists now. Most said they did, but the few who no longer consider themselves to be anarchists still retain some of those anarchist values, beliefs and principles, though to what degree vary between them. For example, Pete said, "Basically, I'm an anarchist. I'm not someone who calls himself an anarchist. I am an anarchist, and I do believe in these things. If anything, I'm more committed to the idea now than I was then. Fundamentally, I believe it's in what you do, the actions you take. The reason I think I'm attracted to the ideology is that it fits well with my personality. You know, it's not something I struggle with. It's ideas that I sort of thought of all that stuff, but didn't have a name to call it. It kind of imbues every decision I make, but not in a conscious way. I don't go, what would an anarchist do in this situation?" Guy also said, "Yes, I do consider myself an anarchist. What kind of anarchist? I'm still working on that. It's all right talking about theoretical stuff, but you've got to get off your backside if you want it to work. You've got to try to make it work in a practical way, which I've tried to do in my jobs and through other things I've done and continue to do in my life." So for both of them, the notion of anarchism has remained as part of a residual anarcho-punk identity, where anarchism is still made meaningful in their current lives by action or practices. Pete in particular states that he is more committed to the idea of anarchism now than he was then, 40 years ago. Further discussion with Pete revealed that maturity and understanding anarchism in more nuanced ways enabled him to appreciate and apply anarchism more cohesively in his daily life. For some of my interviewees, their past anarcho-punk beliefs and values have been revised and refashioned in ways that they consider to be more compatible with their current lives and identities. For example, Kate moved out of and away from anarcho-punk subculture and exited to live in a nomadic lifestyle as a New Age traveller because she perceived that group of people to be living a more anarchic lifestyle. After living a nomadic lifestyle for a number of years, she finally settled within a community of others who have chosen to live to some degree outside of mainstream society. When I asked her if this was a continuation of her anarchist beliefs and her commitment to anarchism, she stated that she still considers herself an anarchist. "Anarchy still means self-rule to me," she said. "It's about living and let living. It's about having respect for other people, and it's about being responsible for your own actions. It's incredibly difficult to do, and it doesn't always work. I mean, living in a community like I do, we like to think we can police ourselves, but it doesn't always work, and sometimes you have to go to the outside world to get it sorted out. It goes against the grain because we have no trust for the police and no trust for the authorities because we know how corrupt they are. We are having to actually get the authorities in to come and sort somebody out in our community who is disruptive, and it's really horrendous having to rely on the outside forces. Kate's narrative pulls into focus the difficulty in attempting to live by a set of principles and values that are part of her residual anarcho-punk identity, but are at times at odds with the society outside of the community within which she lives. Having to call on those representatives of authority that she disapproves of to intervene in this specific case creates an interesting paradox, where her anarchist principles are challenged, and she herself questions the difficulty in wanting to uphold them and live by them. For some of my respondents, the sense of that paradox and tension between wanting to uphold anarcho-punk values and ideologies into later life as residual identity is seen as problematic. Since their introduction to anarchism as anarcho-punks in their adolescence, some of my participants still identify as being anarchists. It seems that this particular element of their residual identities has remained prominent. What has shifted for them, though, is the way in which they manifest their anarcho-punk or anarchist identitarian values, beliefs and ideologies. A common response to how some of them resolve paradoxes between their beliefs, values and ideologies, adulthood, ageing and living in society is best summed up by Phil, who says, "It's about being realistic. I recognise that I don't live in an anarchist society, and at times I have to compromise, well, let's say adjust my anarchist beliefs and just try to change people's outlook and hope that by adjusting my anarchist take on things, I can find more, shall we say, subtle ways of exercising my anarchist beliefs whenever and wherever possible. Most of the people I know, including my work colleagues, know I'm an anarchist, and they know I have remained committed to anarchism since I was a teenage anarcho-punk. I suppose in a nutshell, I do what I can, when I can, whilst living in this capitalist system." His account suggests that his current manifestation of an anarchist identity still focuses on the doing, as highlighted by Guy and Pete's discussions on anarchism earlier. Phil also highlights that the way he thinks and conducts himself is important in the daily manifestation of his anarchist beliefs and values. So in conclusion, my interviewee's exposition of anarchist beliefs and values continues to be exercised through notions of praxis and also through a sense of it becoming a philosophical approach to living and functioning within society. It seems that over time their interpretation of anarchism has remained, and the notion of respecting others and allowing people autonomy in their lives still remains at the forefront of those narratives. However, it seems that over time how that manifests itself has shifted. Some express that in hindsight there's a degree of youthful naivety and utopian idealism in their engagement with anarcho-punk and their interpretation of anarchism in their adolescence. This is best summed up by Adam. "At the time, yes, we thought anarchy was a big, big possibility. Like every 18 and 19-year-old, at that time you wanted to smash the system and change the world for the better, to the way that you believe it should be. I still believe in anarchism. I still believe it's the right way to go. I'm sort of like more of a social anarchist now. I believe that before we have anarchism, we have to live in a socialist society, as it's too much to expect anybody to change overnight into anarchism." For others, their attachment to anarchism over time had waned to varying degrees. So while some of them still consider themselves to be anarchists, others I interviewed did not explicitly identify as anarchists, but still empathised and incorporated some of those anarchist values and ideologies into their current lives.
Thank you for listening. To help others find anarchist essays, please rate and review us wherever you find your podcasts. And if you're interested in anarchist ideas, why not check out the journal Anarchist Studies? For over 20 years, Anarchist Studies has been publishing original research on the history, theory, and practice of anarchism. For more information, visit www.lwbooks.co.uk/anarchist-studies.